CRPN Central, this is Dr. Fox. Thank you for your continued support of the CRPN mission and CRPN Central. If you like this free education, please subscribe to the CRPN Central YouTube channel today and follow us on LinkedIn. If you'd like to join CRPN as a site or a sponsor, contact us today at info@crpaynet.com. Enjoy the show. Don't forget to share your voice for good and positive change in the industry.
Well, that takes care of the budget negotiation. Thank you for working with us. Now for the provisions. As far as screen fails go.
Oh, you don't need to worry about that. We always find our trials run better when we pay for all of the screening services. If we limit our sites, they don't want to work on our trials.
You mean you don't want to impose a screen fail ratio?
Nope. The more you screen, the better the chances.
A discount? A limit?
Why would we want to throttle enrollment? Now we do want to protect ourselves from sites who take advantage of us. But if we are signing a contract with you, we trust you. If our trust is broken, don't plan on future business.
Wow, what a refreshing feeling to feel valued and paid for our work. You can count on us, sponsor. We can't force patients to fit into inclusion-exclusion criteria, but please know we will do our best to recruit and enroll the patients that you need to succeed.
Screen failures, a waste of time and money, or the natural trial and error that organically occurs throughout the research industry. Nobody wants screen failures. Sponsors don't want to spend the money on services that don't produce data. Sites don't want to perform these services without money. And trial candidates won't want to be called failures and be dismissed for the sacrifices that they make. And yet, screen failures happen. It's simply a part of the process, and we must treat them and our stakeholders with the respect that they deserve. Sponsors, you are in clinical research. You will have screen failures, and if they are a direct result of the services that you request from sites, it only makes sense to pay for those services, even if they don't yield the product of data that you are hoping for. Select your sites carefully, pay the good ones for the work that they do, and watch as your trials enroll faster and end efficiently without the need for rescue sites and trial deprioritization. Sites, if you performed services for sponsors, you did your very best to recruit qualified candidates, and unfortunately, they screen failed, you should be paid for the quality services that you provided. Don't accept contracts that force you into working without pay, and be selective with the industry collaborators who respect your time with proper compensation. In time, the good sites will be paid for quality work, the bad sites will be eliminated from the equation, and our patients will have improved access to new and innovative life-saving technology. That, my friends, is not a failure. Welcome to CRPN Central, the official podcast of the Clinical Research Payment Network. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Fox. CRPN Central discusses the real issues with our clinical research industry to explore and identify mutually beneficial solutions for all of our stakeholders. Our industry thrives on productivity and results. Screen failures, however, are neither. And while clinical research sites must exert substantial resources on inevitable screen failure services, sponsors do not want to pay for the work that does not yield data. As frustrations continually rise among unpaid providers and product-focused consumers, how do we properly manage screen failure efforts and budgets for a more understanding and accommodating clinical research industry? Today, we will discuss screen failures in clinical trials, defined as site services for clinical trial candidates who participate in screening processes but do not meet a clinical trial's inclusion or exclusion criteria, and therefore fail to continue into trial randomization. First, we will speak with an experienced clinical site administrator who routinely negotiates and manages screen failure payments. Then we will explore screen failures with a highly experienced site professional who continued into site and CRO project management. To maintain valid comparisons, Both interviews will use the same questions, and my guests did not know the questions before the interviews. We will reconvene after the interview, compare responses, and perhaps identify how we as an industry may better manage screen failure processes and payments for optimal clinical trial performance. Our first guest has substantial frontline experience working with patients, negotiating study contracts, and managing compliant screen fail billing. Alexandra Clark is the co founder of One of a Kind Research, a growing site network that now serves California, Texas, and Arizona. Alexandra has exceptional site level experience into the operations and the financial responsibility of screen failures, and I'm so thankful she has taken the time to speak with us today. Please welcome with me Alexandra Clark. Alexandria Clark, thank you so much for coming on to CRP and Central today.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Fox. It's exciting to be here.
Would you be willing to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, so I'm Alexandria Clark. I'm one of the founders of One of a Kind Clinical Research Center. We work with independent docs to bring research to their practices, currently in California, Arizona, and Texas.
What do you do at One of a Kind?
So I handle a lot more of our admin side stuff. I was a coordinator back when I first started in the industry, but as we've grown, I've taken on more of the budgets, contracts, and admin type side.
You monitor the contracts, you execute them, send the invoices, you negotiate.
Yeah, I do all of that. We're still small enough that I'm pretty hands-on with it all.
How long have you been doing that?
Probably about 2 years that I've been primarily on the admin side.
Do you ever have to deal with screen fails?
A lot. That has been a big subject lately.
So what's changed about it?
I've noticed that in indications where the sponsor already comes in knowing that there's going to be a high screen fill rate, and there's just some indications that they know that every trial with these disease states have high screen fill rates because there's a lot of screening tests that you can't predict or that are very subjective. They have low ratios. And it's hard and frustrating when you know going into this, hey, I know I'm going to have a high screen fail rate and there's no way around this no matter how much pre-screening I do. But then the sponsor's only wanting to pay a low screen fail rate. And you're like, well, is this worth the risk?
Today's topic is screen fails. And by screen fails, I mean those moments where potential candidates are screened to be a part of a trial. Unfortunately, they do not meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So as a result, they're not in the trial. However, sites have performed a substantial amount of work to get to that point. And because it's not productive, sponsors don't want to pay for it. I'm going to ask you a series of questions today, and I'm going to ask those questions to another individual. And we're going to take your answers to these questions, and we're going to compare them to those of the other individuals so that maybe we can try to find some form of alignment or best practices when we manage screen fails at a site.
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
How do you define a screen fail?
I define it as a patient that does not enroll into getting randomized either into placebo or active drug.
How does that apply to payments and contracts?
So that first initial visit, that screening visit where we consent them and we're getting all of this baseline data to figure out if they're eligible, we can do a little bit of that beforehand as far as chart reviews, but you can't really get down into the nitty-gritty of it or run these assessments until after they've consented. And these are usually some of the longest visits of the trial. And sometimes there's surgical biopsies that are taken. There's x-ray scans and other big scans that we have to front these costs for to get this data for this patient. Everything on their chart could look perfect. All their answers could be perfect, but then their scan or their biopsy or one of these tests could come back and make them not eligible to randomize into the trial. And so now we're fronting all this money, not just for these assessments, but also the time of our staff to spend, the reimbursement for the patient, and all the data stuff that we have to do afterwards. And all that's for nothing.
Just imagine after going through med charts, after pre-screening, after doing all of this, you're finally able to screen a patient. You complete the entire visit. You ship out the labs. You send things to central reading. You do biopsies. And after you've done all of this work, then it comes back and it says, well, the patient's labs were off, that something was wrong with the biopsy, the genetic mutation is not there, and therefore they do not meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Unfortunately, we're going to have to screen fail. And the sponsor comes back and says, well, we're not getting data out of that, so we're not going to pay you.
Mm-hmm.
How, as a site, does that feel?
It feels pretty crappy because not only does the staff put in a lot of time, but we're fronting a lot of money. And it's okay, well, how many times can we do this before it's costing us so much money that we're not going to be able to stay afloat? And we should put our time and resources into a different trial. And it's mostly frustrating because we do a lot of due diligence to do that pre-screening, that chart review. But let's say there's a biopsy and their result has to be a 2. And all their historicals show they've been a 2 their entire life. And then we go and run the biopsy, and this central lab says they're a 1.9. There is no way for me to predict that. And there's nothing I could have possibly done to do better to have gotten in a better patient. And so it's pretty disappointing and disheartening.
Sites, they're kind of like a physician's office. They perform services. But imagine if you were a patient going into a doctor's office and you went in and you got your MRI, your X-ray, you got your labs, you got your physical exam, everything. And the doctor comes back with a diagnosis and you look at that and you say, well, I don't like that diagnosis, so I'm not going to pay for any of this stuff that you just did. That's kind of the same way for screen fails. It's like, well, this is kind of crappy. As a service provider, you'd think that if sites perform service according to protocol, there's nothing they could have done otherwise. Don't you think they should be paid for that?
We hear horror stories of sites that don't do their due diligence or collect all the records after, and then they have really high screen fail rates because they're not putting in any pre-effort, especially for these studies that have unlimited screen fails or really high screen fail ratios. And so then these sponsors have to really reel it back in, and it ends up hurting the sites that are trying their best and doing their hardest to bring in these patients because they have to compensate for those sites that aren't somehow.
I think those sites care about one thing. They're essentially milking screen failures.
Yeah.
There are sites that are out there that, according to those horror stories, have manipulated a trial so that they get patients in, they do all these services that they probably shouldn't have done anyway. But if you think about it, there's an ethical problem to that. So those sites maybe shouldn't be in business anyway. But then they'll send the sponsor a big bill and say, oh, these are all screen fails, but you still have to pay for it. So sponsors are sitting here like, you're going to bankrupt us and we are not getting anything out of this. So we have to start protecting ourselves and our budgets from these predator sites.
Yeah. I was talking to a site liaison about this for a study that we are particularly struggling with this in. And I was like, I wish that it was something that we could write in the budget, whereas if they screen fail because of these specific inclusion criteria that have no way to be predicted, then it'll be 100% paid for and everything else is on a ratio.
There are budgets like that. I've seen them. They break the screening visit down and they'll say, okay, we're guaranteed you will be paid for the ICF because you're going to have to do that no matter what. You will be paid for all this stuff that we know you're going to have to do ahead of time. But after that, you're only going to get paid a cap or a discount or a percentage or a ratio of that other half of the screening visit.
Yeah.
But you can negotiate that into your trials.
Ooh, I have not, but that's a really good idea. If we can't know until we consent, if we can't know until we do this, then how are we supposed to pre-screen for those things that we're not allowed to know yet?
We know that there are sponsors that pay for everything. They will pay for all screen fails, all services provided, but they're going to put a little bit of an oversight over the site. But they do pay for everything.
Yeah.
All the way down to no screen fails are paid at all. You're only paid for randomized patients. There's the spectrum. What are the protections that you see in the contracts for these screen fails?
Some of it's that ratio where they will only pay for so many screen fails for each enrolled subject, or will only pay for screen fails up to X amount without approval. And then from there, we have to submit to the sponsor, we want to screen this patient because of X, Y, and Z.
The ratio, that's pretty much where they put the sites on commission for screen fails. Those ratios can either be a fraction or a whole number. The really, really high throughput, high success rate, like vaccine studies, you might have for every 10 patients that you randomize, you'll get 1 screen fail. But if you have the super high screen fail projections, you could get whole number ratios. If you randomize 1 patient, you could get 5 screen fails, 10, 15, depending on how hard it is. So your ratios depend on the complexity of the trial and your perceived risk of screen fail.
Yeah. During that screening process, there's other things that maybe aren't just that screening visit that sometimes get asked of us. Sometimes sponsors include in the budget and sometimes they refuse with every piece of their being retests. So if a patient needs a certain liver lab result in order to be in the study and it comes back a little high on the edge, but the patient's like, ooh, I went out last night. And the sponsor's like, hey, just bring him back for a retest. They retest, it still comes back high. They can't be in the study. And they're like, well, unscheduled visits which aren't a part of that initial schedule of assessments, aren't paid for until after randomization because they're not needed until the patient's randomized. And you're like, but you just asked me to do it.
Yep.
And I had to do it in order to even potentially see if they're going to be in the study. Even when the protocol specifies you're allowed to retest, but then the retests are only considered a part of a randomized subject, not a part of a screen failed subject.
Now, does that fall under the confines of a rescreen?
Sometimes it's under a complete rescreen. Sometimes it's just a repeat of one assessment.
We have these expectations that are not in the contract, they're not in the protocol, but they have to be done for randomization. We have ratios, which we were talking about. We have the caps. You're only allowed so many screen fails without sponsor approval. There's others, they'll pay for all of the screen fails, but they'll do it at a discounted rate.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I've seen is people will actually start to do combinations of all of the different protections. We want the first 5 as a screen fail cap. We get paid everything for the first 5. And after the 5 screen fails, then we'll switch over to a ratio.
Mm-hmm.
Or a discount. Another thing to really pay attention to, try to make sure that you have pre-randomized screen fails. Let's say you have like a 5-to-1 ratio on a really hard trial. They'll say, okay, well, you can have the first 5 screen fails without randomizing a patient, because obviously you're trying to randomize patients and you're going to run into screen fails. So you're going to need to be paid for screen fails while you're finding that first rando.
Yeah, that way you're not waiting for that 5th person to come in and randomize. And then also sometimes there's 2 screening visits. There's a screening and a run-in, and some people screen fill out that screening visit. Some people screen fill out that run-in visit, but either way they haven't been randomized yet. Is the study paying for both of them? Is it paying up to what the patient has done?
Yep. Have you ever seen the situation where sponsors will say, well, sites are only paid for what they do at a screening visit? It's not a flat screening visit, it's itemized. But then what they'll do is they'll say, okay, well, you're only paid for what you do and you have a ratio or some kind of a cap. What happens is, let's say that a patient comes in and they only sign an ICF and then it figures out it didn't work out and they walked out. The site would only get paid for an ICF versus a patient that went through the whole visit and then labs came back and they were not qualified. Well, that patient that is already getting paid at a discount because it's only one activity, it's not a very high pay, that patient counts against the site's ratio.
Ooh, I thankfully have not had that together. We've had ones where they pay screen fails based off invoice of what was done. I think that's a fair compromise. That keeps the CRO feeling like they're not paying for a whole visit if something didn't happen and the visit stopped halfway through. And it's properly compensating us for the time we did put into things. I haven't had it where it's both, but that sucks because if all they're paying is that one line item, it wasn't a full visit that they're paying, but it's counting towards that full visit.
If you're already limited by your number of screen fails, why would you itemize as well? Because you're already restricting the site. You can have these provisions that in combination completely hose the site out of cost.
Yeah. Screen fails get missed a lot too because some systems, or if they're doing it all manually, don't account for screen fail rates and don't account for screen fails are sometimes paid in full and sometimes they're invoiced. And a lot of the online systems for invoicing that way don't flip-flop.
You are spot on. We are running into that with almost every single system out there right now. And unfortunately, it's in forecasting.
Yeah. I think another thing that CROs don't always think of is that patient side. The patients are usually excited to join the study. They're happy. Sometimes we're asking them to come back. Come on, just like come back, redo this test, redo that test. And sometimes they're surgical procedures. Sometimes they're high intensity tests that we have a very short time span to do it. So they're last minute taking off work to try to make this happen, all for the sponsor to turn around and not pay for it or not provide reimbursement for the patient to take that time off work because they're a screen fail.
When you go through this, do you ever look at the patient and say, I'm sorry, you're a screen fail?
I definitely have had patients in rare disease studies that are like distraught not being able to be in the study.
Why would you call a patient a failure? It's not their fault.
Yeah.
What are the disadvantages of screen fails?
Sponsors sometimes can look down at you poorly if you have screen fails and you can feel like, oh, the sponsor is not going to work with me again. Financially, we talked about the visits that go out. If you're projecting, hey, I'm going to get this patient in and they're going to be back every month, not only from a scheduling perspective, but a financial perspective, you now just lost all that and have all this open time that you have to rush to fill.
If I were a site and I was performing services, I would put up every guard possible to make sure that I was paid for those services.
Mm-hmm.
If some kind of a screen fail limitation had to happen, I prefer caps. That way, if the cap has exceeded and I'm no longer assured payment for my services as a site, I just don't recruit patients anymore.
Mm-hmm.
When you're putting up these walls of mistrust, it's what screen fail limitations are. You're essentially creating an inefficiency in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
So now how many patients aren't going to be screened or recruited?
Oh, probably a lot.
Screen fails limit our capacity to be efficient in the industry. I know it's a conservative protection, but if sponsors have to do that, maybe they're just picking the wrong sites.
Yeah. If you're picking sites that you feel like you have to limit in that way, then they're probably not the sites that are trying their hardest and putting in their due diligence. Because it is hard to feel motivated to bring in another patient to screen if you're like, well, there's no way for me to predict or help make sure this patient gets through, and I might not get paid for it.
What are the advantages of screen fails in the industry?
I think the fact that they exist at all, let's say you're talking about construction and they build you a foundation and the foundation cracks. They don't get to charge you for another foundation, usually. And so I think the fact that they exist at all allow us to bring in more patients to try, because a lot of times standard of care is not the exact same assessments as screening for a research study. If there was no screen fail payments whatsoever, you're not going to bring in anyone who doesn't meet this magic situation, and you're going to miss out on all these patients.
That's a good point. So it's a little bit of an assurance of payment in the event patients are not qualified.
Yeah. If there wasn't screen fails, you have to pay such a higher rate once there is a patient in to compensate for all that work that the sites did through the screen fails. And you'd see patient rates go skyrocket because it has to compensate for the screen fails somehow.
Yeah, you'd be cost shifting it the whole
Mm-hmm.
time. Sometimes screen fail is a consequence to a site. They don't want high screen fail ratios. And I wonder if sometimes because there's a consequence, whether it be financial or by reputation, sites think twice about screening patients because of the screen fails. The quantification of the screen fail allows a site the consequence to really think about whether or not they should screen that patient.
Definitely. And we've definitely had times where we just make that choice ourselves, and times where we've reached out to the sponsor and said, hey, we're not sure if we should screen this patient because is it going to be worth our time and money? And here's the reasons why. Most sponsors come back and say, just screen them, screen as many as you can. We want screenings in. But then the budget team goes, no, we don't.
I don't want to pay for that.
Part of that too is that communication between all those different departments.
How may we improve screen fail payment processes for better overall industry performance?
Making that standard that they're unlimited, but with monitoring, and that those sites that are truly just willy-nilly throwing in patients without ever seeing a medical record, the sites that are just doing it to get the money, that those ones are being monitored and watched, or something in the contract that says, if you do this, we can reevaluate putting you on like a approval first before screening list. That way the sites that are doing their due diligence aren't slowed down or not promoting the study because they're worried about something.
I agree. Sites do work, equal sites get paid, but that also means sites have to do responsible work.
Yeah.
You have to build that trust with the sponsor and the site to the point where they're not going to have these kinds of provisions in a contract.
Mm-hmm.
Before you were an administrator and you were a CRC,
Mm-hmm.
in your day to day or in your responsibilities, how aware were you of the financial consequences of screen fails?
Enough to feel immensely guilty when I had a patient that screen failed. So where I wasn't invoicing, I didn't know how much that meant. I just knew screen fails were bad and meant we didn't get a patient in the study. We were more talking about big picture of this patient will come in this many times and we have to meet these goals in order to keep the site afloat. It was a big scary thing on, oh no, I only need 2 patients in this study in order to keep my job. And I just had a screen fail. It's scary when you're at the bottom level and you know just a little bit.
Did you ever know that it was possible that you were doing work and the site wasn't getting paid for what you did?
Yeah, definitely. And then you're sitting there, well, I could have spent this last 4 hours recruiting. I could have been spending more time on my other patients that are going through this or that. And it just feels like a waste of time.
That's what I find in a lot of the sites. The operations teams, like the coordinators, they distance themselves from the financial aspects. I'm here to focus on the patient. I want to help the patient. That's what I do. Finance isn't my job. Then you have a conversation with them. You do realize what you're doing right now. We have no chance of gaining money for this. You are spending site resources and it's not getting recouped. Maybe there's like an educational level on this. We have awesome podcasts that can raise awareness into the research industry so that people can know, oh my gosh, there is a consequence to what I'm doing here. And
Mhm.
if I do this improperly, then it actually hurts my site and my community.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people keep it separate, one, because most companies don't want their staff to know all their finances, and two, you don't want the coordinator to be making choices based off the finances. You want them to be making choices based off the patient's well-being,
Yep.
and you don't want them to ever feel like, ooh, well, if the patient withdraws right now, then like we won't get paid. So maybe I should tell them, just wait till next visit. At the same time, it's good to be aware of what's happening so that you can use your time wisely.
If I were to hand you the microphone right now and I said, what would you like to tell the entire industry about screen fails, what they are, and what we can do to better manage them? What would you tell them?
Screen fails are a helpful part and an important part of the clinical trial process, and it is not something that you can get rid of or completely avoid, and it is work being done by the sites. And good sites are trying to minimize their screen fails, not only for financial purposes, but also to help their patients and help their community and get the data out there to the sponsors. And that sponsors should understand that most sites and most good sites should not be held accountable for the sites that are not doing their due diligence, and that they can work together with the sites to come up with good compromising solutions to make sure everybody feels like they're being treated fairly.
So maybe a little bit of an understanding from both sides, maybe site and sponsor both considering the situations of each other. Site should be responsible to the resources of the sponsor. Sponsors should be aware of all of the efforts that are put into trying to screen these patients. And maybe if we consider that and we don't punish the good sites for the actions of the bad sites, we select the right sites in the first place. And if you're looking for any, I guarantee you One Oak is one of them. And we essentially come together to try to minimize unnecessary screen fails, but at the same time, maximize as many screenings as possible to get the job done. I think we would have a much better industry.
Yeah, that is perfectly said.
Alexandria, thanks so much for coming on to CRPN Central. An excellent interview. I look forward to the follow up live event. We'll see you soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dr. Fox.
I'll talk to you later.
All right, bye.
Bye. Our next guest has fostered significant experience, not only in site level patient coordination and contracts, but also within the CRO project management space. Lisa Shea holds over 20 years of experience working at private sites, academic centers, and CROs. Her comprehensive understanding of screen failures from all sides brings an intuitive perception into our industry's challenges, and I am so thankful she's taken the time to speak with us today. Now, I understand my microphone quality was reduced early in the interview, but I need to ask you to focus clearly on the important content that we covered in this interview. I think it's going to help you a lot. Please welcome with me Lisa Shea. Lisa Shea, thank you so much for coming on to CRPN Central today.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be chatting with you today.
Would you be willing to introduce yourself to the audience?
I started in research almost 20 years ago. I got into research as a research assistant at a psych facility, and I say that that's kind of where I got bit by the bug. I quickly got into coordinating and went from there to another coordinating role in ophthalmology. I liked learning different things, supporting the investigators, all aspects of the clinical trial. From there, I actually got into project management, which was really, really exciting. I worked at an academic research facility where I got to support investigators, and I got to start mentoring and working with different residents, medical students, training them all aspects of clinical trials. I spent about 14 years at the site in all those different capacities before I went to the CRO, where I became a project manager at a couple different CROs.
Project management at CRO with substantial site background. So I always wondered if there were employees at CROs who had that kind of a site background, who understood the process on the site level so that they could try to get things working over on the CRO sponsor level.
Yeah, in my experience, that's not very common to have people in the CRO space with a background at the sites, especially at the project management level. You see it maybe sometimes at the CRA level, where they might have started out as a coordinator and then transitioned to a CRA. Most project managers that I've encountered have only ever been at the sponsor or the CRO side. It's not very, very common at all. I use my site experience, I use my site background every day in supporting the site.
Have you ever had to work with or around contracts and screen fails?
Yes. How are they built in? Do they get compensated for screen fails? How much of the screen fail do they get compensated for?
A pre-randomization screen fail versus a non, or even the amount of money that sites could lose if they continually screen and don't get paid for the work that they do.
Exactly. Because pre-screening, that's how you get the patients in. It takes time, but how do you compensate for that? At the site level, we had a specific line item for that. It's critical. That's the start. That's the tip of the iceberg.
Today's topic is screen fails, specifically screen fails and how our sites either work for free or negotiate it properly so that they can get paid, quote, fairly, or even why we might be doing what we're doing in screen fails. I'm going to ask you a series of questions today, and I've already asked these questions to another individual. And so we're going to take your answers and we're going to compare it to the other individuals so that maybe we can try to find some form of alignment with our understandings of screen fails and how we can better manage them for a more positive experience in the industry.
Wonderful. Yes.
How do you define a screen fail?
It goes into, does the patient have the qualifying condition? Do they have the qualifying needs to be in the study? The proper age range? Do they have the proper treatment history? Do they have to be treatment naive or are they not treatment naive? And kind of looking at digging into their eligibility criteria. And then when you come to the answers, no, they don't meet criteria. They're not eligible to be enrolled, becoming a screen fail.
What kind of efforts do sites have to put into screen fails?
Oh my gosh, it's exorbitant. There's not just a consent process, but there's a conversation that happens before that. Find out if the patient's eligible, long conversation. And I haven't even gotten to the screening part. That's the pre-screening part.
And sometimes, depending on the trial, sponsors have to approve screening visits. If it's like a super duper crazy rare disease or a really expensive oncology procedure, they have to approve these. So sites and coordinators, they're going to have to sit there and schedule and talk to people and figure out if a patient's qualified and then go through all the stakeholders and schedule that visit and then get the patient in. They complete the screen visit, let's just say that, talk to the doctors, collect the labs, ship everything out, collect the biopsies, all this work performed. And then the sponsors sit there and say, oh, a screen fail. Sponsors don't necessarily want to pay for all this work performed. Sites are service providers. According to the CTA, the site organization and the PI agree to provide clinical research services. Let's say I was a patient and I walked into a doctor's office and I got all this work, all this prep, all this workup, everything. And then I go through and I say, oh, I don't like that diagnosis. I'm not going to pay for it at all. Thanks a lot for all that work you did.
Thanks for the labs.
Thanks for the labs. I'm not going to pay for it. That's equivalent to what happens when sponsors come to sites and say, hey, we want you to try to get patients in this trial. Here's the protocol. Here's this crazy inclusion-exclusion criteria. By the way, if you don't randomize the patients, we're not going to pay you. So we're pretty much putting you on commission, so to speak. At what point do you think our industry got to a level where sponsors go to a service provider and expect product, not service?
I think it has a lot to do with the lack of trust fueled by a very small number of sites that are not trustworthy. And then you go into applying that skepticism to all the sites. Do sites do inappropriate things? Yeah, there are a few. And that's part of the selection process to identify those out. Are there sites that do the right thing? Absolutely. And when we take that skepticism because there's some unethical people doing what they shouldn't be doing, that does exist, but we can't apply it to everyone. You know, we have all this news at our fingertips of how sites might do the wrong thing, and those get highlighted. But we don't talk about the sites and the abundance of sites that do the right thing and really want to be successful. There's more good, but there's more emphasis on the bad. And I think that's where the sponsors went wrong and they become too skeptical for that service provision.
And I will be the first one to tell you, there are sites out there who milk screen fails. Maybe 1 in 100 sites. Those ones that milk screen fails, they don't last much past those first couple trials because they're terrible quality. But they've done their damage to everyone else. So now sponsors are afraid that everyone's trying to milk them dry without a product. And so as a result, they put in these provisions in a contract. You've looked at these contracts. So how do sponsors protect themselves from the quote bad sites?
So I've seen a few different options. I think there's pros and cons to a lot of them. We actually had it written in that we could invoice for 1 screen fail per 3 randomized subjects. So if we took 5 patients in order to get 1 randomized subject, we could only invoice for 3 of those. But the footnote on that was it was a flat rate. So it didn't matter if we did everything, there was 1 flat rate. Another provision that I've seen is where sponsors will allow an itemized invoicing for the screening visits. So if you only obtain consent, you invoice for that consent. If you obtain consent and do assessments, then you invoice for those too, and so on. Those are, I think, the most common ones that I've seen over the course of my career, with the latter being much, much more common than the first one.
You're spot on. There's forks in the provision. The first fork, is this a flat rate? Do you pay the same no matter what, or is it itemized? But then once you get from flat to itemized, then you start talking about the limitations. What you had just mentioned, the ratio, the screen fail ratio, that's where you're pretty much putting sites on commission. Now, the ratio can also be separated into whether they're pre-randomized. You can invoice those first few patients before you randomize a patient because you're going to go through some screen fails and you're going to need continued revenue, or not pre-randomized.
Yeah, that's very true. And you have no learning curve because the first couple patients on every single study, I don't care how much experience anyone has, is going to have a learning curve, not the research, but in terms of the actual protocol.
You have a ratio. Of course, then the other one is the cap. Sponsors say you are allowed this finite amount of screen fails. And you could still go itemized or flat, but you're allowed a cap, not a ratio.
One of the things that's also missed in a contract that's written like that is an opportunity to renegotiate. Because just like that learning curve, the sites learn about the study and they might learn, oh, screening and enrollment is a lot tougher in execution than in the ivory tower of just reading the protocol. So maybe we need to revisit the contract and looking at that cap again.
Most of the time in a cap CTA, there's always the provision that says that sponsors may at their discretion approve additional screen fails. That's a really good point for the sites. Sites, if you're listening to this and you're negotiating, you could put in there upon the first X number of screen fails, sites reserve the right to renegotiate now that they've understood the protocol more. The third limitation that I've seen is, of course, the percent discount of a screening visit. It could be the sponsor will pay for 40% of the screening visit. You're going to get paid for that screen fail, but you're going to get it at a discounted rate. The kicker is when you take ratios, caps, and discounts, and you start melding them into the same contract. Sites are going to get paid for 1 screen fail for every 3 randomized, but at a 40% discount. Or sites can get paid the first 3 screen fails, and then they revert into a ratio. They take those 3 provisions, and then they start melding them into different kinds of CTAs and all these different ways to protect themselves. The extremes on both ends are, number 1, sponsors sit there and they pay for everything. Or if you don't randomize, you don't get paid. It's that balance between pay for everything, pay for nothing, and then all these weird provisions in between where sponsors have created this really weird monster of ways not to pay sites for services performed.
Looking at the discounted idea in the contract, they're not discounting the work the sites are doing. They're not doing 40% of the work. The discounted doesn't make much sense to me. Your cap doesn't make much sense to me. The site doesn't have control over what the eligibility criteria is. So it might have been very restrictive.
And when asked for a justification for providing these limitations to payment, I've literally heard a CRO negotiator say, we have to keep you sites on your toes and motivated to continue working on the trial. That was their response. Apparently, for a service provider, you have to threaten not getting paid in order to continue working on a trial?
Wow.
Well, we know where that trial went, right into the garbage.
People work with who they like to work with. And if it's a very contentious interaction, they're not going to like working with you.
As a site, if I had two trials in front of me and one of them was assuring payment for the services I perform and the other is a risk, which trial am I going to choose?
Right.
I'm a business. I'm going to choose the one that pays me.
Right. Exactly.
Sponsors, when you put in these crazy provisions and your trial gets deprioritized at a site, don't blame the site. You're literally giving them a reason not to want to work for you.
It might not be they don't want to. They may not be able to. Having worked at a site, if we weren't getting paid, we weren't able to do that job. We could have loved working with them, but if we can't afford to do that work, we're going to focus on something that pays the bills.
What are the disadvantages of screen fails?
I don't see a lot of disadvantages to screen fails. You can actually learn a little bit about how good is your eligibility criteria from the screen fail. That's helpful information. So I actually find a lot of value in screen fails when the site is doing the right thing, when the sponsor is listening to the sites.
It never fails. So when sponsors first write their protocols, it's very stringent. And then they go to try to start screening, and all of a sudden everyone's screen fails because of this crazy inclusion exclusion criteria that may not necessarily align with their primary endpoints anyway. And so as a result of the screen fail, it's kind of like that feedback mechanism where sponsors can sit there and say, you know what, we're going to do a protocol amendment, we're going to loosen the inclusion exclusion and try to get more patients on the trial.
Is it really that important? Was it part of the wish list or was it part of the need list?
Or was it just part of a template from the last trial?
Very good point. That happens a lot. More and more applicable to real life.
And that's the other thing. Sometimes these protocols are written in a vacuum. And then when you start to hit the real world, those dreams of the scientists that wrote this thing, like an animal study, it's not working, you're going to have to start making adjustments.
Right.
So screen fails can provide a massive amount of helpful information. It's very unfortunate that we turn this into some kind of a punishment to sites simply for just trying to do their services. What are the advantages of screen fails?
There's a lot of information that can be translated over to either future studies, the actual implementation, and going into the real world. If we have a huge screen fail rate, maybe we need to evaluate, are we even still seeing that in the clinical world? Not research, but in the clinical world. Is this still a clinical need? Or do we need to change our focus a little bit? Do we need to look at something a little bit different? If we're writing our eligibility criteria based on endpoints, maybe our endpoints are missing the mark. Do we need to go back a little bit further, take 2 steps back instead of just 1 step back? And so it might allow us to understand more of the clinical need if we're looking for it.
Sometimes reasoning for screen fails altogether could be its own trial.
Yeah.
Do inclusion exclusion criteria actually match the patient populations that we're targeting?
Right. We might be looking for a unicorn that doesn't exist.
Or we may be trying to solve a solution that doesn't even have a problem.
Right.
Coming from a site's perspective, if I do have a contract that somehow limits my screen fails, I do think twice before I act on services. If I know the sponsors aren't offering a blank check, so to speak, and not all services are paid, I have to be conservative with what I do. I wonder if that might be the culture that sponsors are trying to encourage.
If we look at it from a very collaborative potential solution, it could go into, all right, let's refine your pre-screening process. And maybe that's where the conservative approach comes in, not I don't want to work with them or I don't want to do that, but maybe we need to refine what we look at before we reach out to the potential subjects. 1, to be efficient, and 2, to be efficient with the dollars that need to be going around.
How may we improve the screen fail payment process for better overall industry performance?
I think itemized is always the way to go, honestly. It's not a blank check. You might get that site that does the wrong thing and recruits friends to come in and say they did stuff. And maybe they'll be able to convince people they know to participate, knowing that it's not going to go anywhere, just to invoice for this itemized thing. That's not the majority. Paying sites for the work they do, frankly, I think that's the best and most fair way to go. I've always liked a budget and a contract being written, not with a cap, not with a percentage discount, but with an itemized list. Most of the sites want to help their patients. I don't think there's anyone that can deny that. With that in mind, doing the itemized thing compensates the sites for the work they do. It ensures that the sponsors are going to capture as many patients as possible on their trial. And it's fair at the end of the day.
Sites do work, sites get paid. Itemized is the way of the business. What we run into as far as a challenge with that is when sites are required to itemize for services provided, but they're not given the structure to itemize properly. Prime example, let's say those 30-minute booster calls. Hey, how's the recruitment going? Should sites be able to itemize that and charge for that time that they spent working and engaging with the sponsor and CRO? If we go into an itemized level, should the sites create some kind of an itemized system where they do actually capture the payments for all of the work that they perform for a trial?
I laugh because if you have a lawyer on retainer, you have a 5-minute call with your lawyer, you're getting invoiced for that 5-minute call. If a sponsor is requesting a call with a CRO, they're going to include that. Why don't we apply the same to the site? It is effort completed. It's time that they're not doing something else. That is fair. It is work completed.
That's a very interesting point. Why the double standard? Why can't we treat sites like CROs to that point where sites charge for their time just like CROs do?
I think it really boils down to trust, truly. I think what's commonly forgotten is it's a collaborative effort, whether we're at the CRO, whether we're at the sponsor, or whether we're at the site. We are here to improve the options for patients with particular conditions. We don't go back to the root of what it is we're doing.
We lose our why in the dollar signs and the budgets and contracts and the arguing. And granted, we are here to improve care, but everyone is a business as well, and they're going to have to pay their bills. Without the money, you're not going to do the work.
I do not disagree in any way with that. And I think what's forgotten is sponsor CROs tend to lose sight of that, because having transitioned from patient facing at the site to project management, no longer patient facing at the site, to project management and one further step removed, it's actually really easy to lose track of the patients. They're not in our face. We're not looking at the schedule. And yes, zero doubt about it, sponsors, CROs, and sites are all businesses. And we have to be fair. Forgetting about the patients and the noble why loses sight of the fair.
It's easy to lose your why when you're surrounded by zeros and timelines and deadlines and budget constraints and things like that. The only difference between a site and a CRO is the number of zeros on their RFPs and their contracts. That's it. CROs get a bunch of money. Sites don't see that much money, but also sites don't have to manage 150 sites.
They don't have the database management, all these things. Yeah.
Exactly. And then you start doing regulatory and all this other stuff. And there are some things that sites don't see, where CROs have higher visibility into the overall flow of the trial. CROs don't have visibility into the micro processes that are required to perform those tasks. So we have to work together.
Right. And be collaborative.
CROs, you really need to understand exactly the amount of work that it takes to do what you're asking sites to do. Because I think that you're taking a lot of efforts for granted. Even on the budgets that pay for everything ScreenFail, you're still expecting sites to do a ton of work.
Yeah, there's a submission of documents. Is redacting a chart easy? Yeah, it's pretty easy. It takes time. It takes a lot of time in some cases, especially if you need to provide a lot of information. To dismiss that piece as well is going to be a problem. Sites need the ability to say, I'm taking away from this billable task that I could invoice somebody else for to take care of this. And it's a need. Time is money.
If I were to hand you the microphone right now and I said, what would you like to tell the entire industry about ScreenFails and the challenges we have and how we can make them better, what would you tell them?
I would tell all three stakeholders, sponsor, CRO, and site, have your open communication, have a conversation, learn about what the needs are, and listen to what the obstacles are on both sides, all of it. One of the things that we've come away from with emails and Teams messaging and stuff like that is a willingness to get in a conversation and talk through different things. And it's not just talking through it at the first execution of the contract. They're not set in stone. Revisit it if necessary. If it's not working, find out why and fix it. Course correct.
Talk to each other, pick up the phone, be willing to listen to and learn from each other so that we know each other's needs. And if we really become humble, a little more empathetic maybe, then maybe we can have a better understanding of what we need for each other and therefore come together to ensure everyone has a positive experience.
And we all reach our goal. And at the end of the day, the patient wins.
Lisa, thanks so much for coming on to CRPN Central. An excellent interview. I look forward to sharing this with the audience. I really appreciate you coming on today.
Thanks so much for having me, Dr. Fox. I appreciate your time.
I'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye. Alexandria has worked at the site level as a CRC and has now focused on site level administration, contracts, budgets, and financial management for the past 2 years. She must work with screen fails all of the time and experiences a site level frustration when sponsors who predict high percentages of screen failures continue to expect sites to accept low payment ratios. Screening visits require intense time and substantial resources that are difficult for sites to shoulder without sponsor support. Frankly, it feels pretty crappy when sites front money for screening visits and then are not paid. We've heard the horror stories. Some sites do not perform due diligence. They charge sponsors for screening costs and therefore force sponsors to create protections from all sites with ratios, caps, and limits. Sites should be paid for what was done, and coordinators know the weight of screen failures and limited enrollments, especially on their job security. And if we build trust with our stakeholders, we communicate between departments, pay the good sites appropriately, and hold only the bad sites accountable by monitoring their screening practices, we may build a stronger industry with efficient recruitment and overall success. Lisa has worked in the clinical research industry from the site and patient-facing level to administrative and project management roles for over 20 years. Screen failures and their pre-screening activities require exorbitant efforts, lots of work, and sometimes even sponsor approvals. And while sites are contractually service providers, they are expected to provide a product due to the skepticism and mistrust resulting from a few bad sites who take advantage of sponsors. To protect from these bad sites, sponsors impose screen failure ratios, caps, and discounts, which do not make sense because sites certainly don't have discounted service expectations. Sites, who will always have to battle a learning curve for each of their trials, will be forced to prioritize the trials that actually pay the bills for their services, which cultivates a continuous cycle of mistrust, increased costs, and overall trial failure. Screen failures are not a waste of time and money if we learn from them, and if we work towards site compensation systems that itemize and pay for all of a site's services, just like the CROs, and we build professional relationships of trust. We listen and learn from each other, and we build an understanding of everyone's needs. We will all reach our goals and overall improve patient lives. Both of today's guests unanimously validated the challenges that sites have with screen failures and proper support. They noted the industry's restrictions are based off of the actions of only a few sites. They confirmed best practices to itemize and pay sites for all of the services that they perform. And they agreed that communication and understanding with all stakeholders is critical toward positive and productive solutions. And while Alexandria noted the importance of our coordinators making decisions based off of patient safety and trial performance, Lisa highlighted the significant value that screen failures bring to the sponsors who carefully assess and course correct as needed. So, how do we properly manage screen fail efforts and budgets for a more understanding and accommodating clinical research industry? As Alexandria discussed the quality, performance, and justified costs of the good sites, and Lisa noted the consequences of the contention and mistrust between industry stakeholders, our interviews agreed upon 3 distinct principles and best practices. To better manage and control screen fails in the industry, we must concentrate closely on communication, trust, and understanding. Stakeholders should openly talk with each other and explain their perspectives. They should build a trusting relationship with each other and eliminate the bad players from the equation rather than punish everyone. And they should learn from each other and understand the screen failure process holistically to learn lessons, course correct, and work to improve the clinical trial experience for everyone involved. That, my friends, is not a failure. Thank you for tuning in to today's very insightful screen failure episode. Remember, our patients are never the failures, and neither are the processes. If anything is a failure, it's our overall failure to successfully collaborate and communicate with each other. Let's work together to fix that, and work together to succeed in our mutual objectives. Thank you to Alexandria and Lisa for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you to my CRPN Voice volunteers for participating in today's CRPN Short. Finally, thank you to my CRPN Central sponsors for making this podcast possible. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time on CRPN Central.